Welcome to Empire Echoes, the podcast that will answer all of your questions on the British Empire and its colonies. Today we have me, David Balawa, and Manali,
Hello.
the questioner. And today we are looking at the Falkland Islands and how the British control them to this day. This territory of the UK may be small, but it's really important. Now we are going to have our first question.
Okay, Devik. My first question is that what were these islands like before British colonization?
Before the Europeans came, the island was uninhabited and isolated with a harsh climate. Forests did not grow there. However, there is evidence that penguins and seals were hunted in ancient times, possibly by the Yogans, who sometimes came to the islands. In the 16th century, some European explorers may have seen the islands. These people did not write this down, so there is debate on who discovered the islands first. European people did not show interest in these islands at the time.
Wow, that was really great to know that European people were not interested in these islands before at that time. And that makes me to ask you my next question. How did British colonize these islands? Can you please explain me in detail, Devik?
Well, you see, in 1690, English explorer John Strong was explored the islands and named the strait between them the Falkland Strait after the Viscount of Falkland, who sent him to Chile to find the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship. There he finds many things, including the Falklands wolf, which resembled a mix between a wolf and a fox. And that animal is actually endemic to the Falklands. We'll actually talk a bit about it later. In 1765, the British set up a colony in the Falkland Islands, which they called Port Egmont, unaware that the French had done the exact same thing on the other side of the islands a year earlier.
So they both were together at the same time they started and they were not aware about each other's.
No, because they were not aware. Because the French were on the east side of the islands and the British were on the west. However, I think around a year after the British set up their colony in Port Egmont, the French, they managed to meet each other in the middle, and yeah. So then the Spanish wanted the islands. So they explained to France that the Pope had drawn a line between Spain and Portugal, that on one side,
Just to interrupt you, how the Spanish people, they knew that French and the British people are trying to conquer these islands?
because they would have sent expeditions around the world, especially since in that area were the South American colonies like Argentina and Uruguay. So they said that on one side, so the Pope said that on one side it would be the Spanish territory, and on the other side it would be the Portuguese territory, and the Falkland Islands fell under the Spanish side. That meant that they told the French to go away from the islands, and they actually paid the French to let them have their islands. And the French warned the Spanish about the British on the other side.
Okay, so Spanish people actually paid money to get the ownership of these islands to the France.
Yes.
Okay.
Especially because it was a good way to go around the Americas, which actually proved later really well in the California gold rush. So the Spanish came and they told the British the same thing that they told the French, but the British did not move away. This might be kind of ironic because the Pope is a Catholic figure, and at that point I'm pretty sure the British were a Protestant country, so that might be the reason. So the Spanish basically they just came and they had more arms on the island, like military people, like soldiers and guns. So they actually kicked Britain off of the islands, and London started preparing for war. Now the Spanish went back to the French because the French don't like the English. However, the French were not ready to fight as they were already in their own troubles. So Spain had to let Britain back onto the islands.
So basically, French people, they did not support Spanish people to get that island back. So yeah, British came back to those islands. That's interesting facts, just for a small islands, the way the European country who initially were not interested to even bother to look into that, and now they are just arguing that who will own that islands.
Yeah. Now, both the English and the Spanish people both had to leave the island several times. For example, when the American Revolution happened, Britain had to leave the island and they didn't come back for a long time, but they left a plaque saying that the Falkland Islands was still in their possession. The Spanish also had to leave at a later time when Napoleon started invading the Spanish and their South American territories started to vie for independence. So they both had to leave. And it's funny because they have small islands and they left it for like the bigger colonies. So a lot of things have happened. And after Argentina became independent, they actually went onto the islands and started to take them for their own, which would lead us on to the next question.
So the next question is, what were the resistance to this British occupational colony?
So if I continue my story of the Falklands, then I think you'll understand that one of the most resisting rule to the British in the Falklands is Argentina. So Argentina actually kept staying there, and ever since they came, Britain went back and reminded the Argentinians that the island was still theirs according to their plaque. So they kicked Argentina off the islands in the same way that the Spanish did so long ago. So they especially got really angry. So the Argentinians kind of got angry about that, but they didn't do much. But they kept reinforcing their claim. So a man called Varney from Hamburg wanted to go to the Falkland Islands as a private venture. Now he felt kind of like annoyed because the Americans kept whaling and also hunting down the seals there. So they took some Americans prisoner after the Argentinians gave him some weapons and appointed him governor of the island. Now, two things happened. Firstly, the Americans got kind of angry, so they completely destroyed Port Louis, which was called Port Soledad, since the Spanish had taken over. So yeah, and the British actually thought that this meant that the Argentinians actually really thought that the islands were theirs, which didn't make the British very happy. So they now really kicked them off, and they fully controlled the Falkland Islands from that point.
So you mean to say the British people had fully control on the islands? They kicked out the Argentinian people.
Yes, they made sure that the Argentinians knew what they were doing, and that they were doing was not controlling the Falkland Islands. So in 1840, the Falkland Islands became a crown colony, which is still its status, meaning that it's not independent. Port Stanley, a bit south of Puerto Soledad, became the capital 5 years later. And in 1851, cattle were like going down in the market, so they started importing sheep from Britain. However, the sheep started to make the population of the Falklands wolf dwindle down. But so after that, relations became better with Britain and Argentina. So it they actually even had um an airline together connecting Port Stanley to Buenos Aires, and this was in secret until they actually started doing business. So I'm pretty sure it happened in 1971, especially since the British had to leave a bit after World War II, so they came back and they made that deal. So they even Argentinians did a lot of things. They even sent Spanish teachers on site to teach the language. They did many things to help the British economic condition, and I'd say that things were doing really well with the British and the Argentinians. So after that, a brutal dictatorship came in Argentina, which was actually sponsored by the Americans. However, they weren't as nice to the British as they were to the as the old Argentinians were. So in 1981, late 1981, Leopoldo Galtieri was the leader of Argentina. So he actually did a lot of things, and his country was starting to be less successful, and that made him pretty sad. So he started a war of the Falkland Islands, or the Islas Malvinas as they were called in Spanish. So he actually started, without a war declaration, to invade the English part of. They started to invade the Falkland Islands. Now, this was really bad for the English, as they had chosen a really good time to strike, because the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was quite controversial, had cut a bit of military spending. And also because of the economic downturn of England. So he started to invade, and after a bit they had fully controlled the Falkland Islands, the Argentinians. Now, the Argentinians thought that the British would do nothing about this, considering the British's economic status. However, Margaret Thatcher was a tough person, so she actually wanted to fight them. So the war started on the 2nd of April 1982, which is when they started invading. And yeah, so it started the entire thing. So it was so the Americans, who actually sponsored the dictatorship, went up to Margaret Thatcher to try to persuade her to not invade let the Argentinians have the Falkland Islands. However, they didn't. So they were actually supplied weapons. So around the world, including the UN itself, didn't support the Argentinians' invasion. However, all the South American countries except Chile did. So the British, naturally, they just went, and they had much less troops than the Argentinians. However, the Argentinians were less trained well. So the first was the Navy. So the Navy of the UK is incredibly strong, especially at that time. So they actually sunk an Argentinian ship outside of the exclusion zone. And that basically secured that. However, the Argentinian Air Force dominated the skies, and it even sunk the HMS Sheffield. they had British aircraft like Sea Harriers had to try and they had so the Sea Harriers had to sink the Argentinian aircraft. So it was actually really hard for them to actually fight the Argentinians because they were much closer to the Falkland Islands. Like if you look on Google Maps, which you might be doing right now, you can see that the Argentinians are really close compared to the UK. So the British obviously had a more trained ground force. So even they had more. So even they had superiority on the ground. So they started in, I think, Santo Carlos, I think. So they started in Santo Carlos and they expanded. So this is on the island which Port Stanley is on. So they just kept going everywhere. And then was one of the most influential battles of the Falklands, which is the Battle of Goose Green, which was on the 28th of May in 1982. So the same year that the war started. So the Battle of Goose Green, it was a really big turning point on how the British managed to invade the Falklands and win the war. So eventually they went out of Goose Green and they finally managed to invade Port Stanley after going through the hills and mountains around it. On the 14th of June 1982, after hundreds being killed and injured, the Argentinians surrendered to the British.
So finally the British people got the ownership of Falkland Islands.
Yes, and they still do to this day.
Okay.
That leads us on to our next question.
Actually, I was thinking as well, the next question. So basically, Argentinian people left in 1982 in June and the British were there. So when these islands, they become an independent places?
So the Falkland Islands actually are not independent.
Really?
Yeah, so I've said it quite a few times, but because it's a question, we obviously have to mention it specifically. So the Falkland Islands becoming independent isn't really that complicated because most of the people who live there are actually either descendants of British people or like people which have come from around the world. So the Falklands are actually a very multicultural place. So they have people from all around the world.
You mean to say they don't have a native people who used to live there? So it's just people comes all around the world because it's still British colony.
Mostly it's the British people, and there's also loads of other ethnicities. But in 2013, they held a referendum to see whether they wanted to become, whether they wanted to still be a British overseas crown colony. And overwhelmingly, it was 99.8% of voters actually voted to stay. Only 3 people actually voted to say to not want to stay as a British overseas crown colony. So yeah, that's funny.
So basically they are still not an independent places. But I want to still ask a question. So what make it, like, what type of changes were there before the British people came over there and after it becomes British colony? Like native people, how they were living, or there were people over there or not? Something I just would like to know that. What are the changes happen on these islands after the British people came?
So there are actually many things that have actually changed between, for example, people didn't live there before and now there's quite a big population of the right now. Which actually leads really closely to our last question.
Now, my next question is, what is this Falkland Islands are like now? And do you think so in the series of modern day and centuries that are successful, or do you think it has suffered as a consequences of being under British rule?
So I think that it is more successful now, as in the past there was literally no one there, and it was under war constantly. Nowadays you can actually see it's a thriving country, and I think that we should not forget about the Falkland Islands, as it's a very important place. Additionally, uh, additionally, after the Falklands War, the UK managed to open trade routes around the world with the Falkland Islands, as it was a very good way, especially in the olden times, for people to stop there and mend their ships. And after the Falkland Islands War, it managed to start routes with Chile, and then it really started to shine. And nowadays, its main sources of income, I'm pretty sure it's like squid, fishing and whaling, and tourism as well.
Which they use like money wise, like a British pound currency they have.
Actually, they have their own currency called the Falkland Pound. It's a bit. I think one Falkland Pound is like 0.955 British pounds. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, the population is actually now 3,500. Actually, I think it's a bit more than that, but 3,500 is an approximate number. A lot of languages are spoken there. A lot of ethnicities live there, and it's a very multicultural place, and it's also really beautiful landscape as well. Yeah.
So people go for holidays to Falkland Island.
Yes, as I said previously, tourism is one of its main sources of income. Now it's time for the last question.
My goodness, lot of information. Trust me, before listening to you, I had no idea anything about Falkland Islands. Now my final question to you, Devik, is that why did you choose particularly this place to speak about British colonization? What leads you to select these islands? What is the speciality about these islands to talk about them? Obviously, for me, it was very beneficial, and to our listeners as well. Like, I haven't heard many people talking about Falkland Islands.
So I actually chose the Falkland Islands because the only thing it's known for is the Falklands War, which is not all it's about. It's more than just one war that lasted for 2 months. It has such a long, rich history, and I believe that it's being overlooked. And I remember watching this video about Brexit in the Falklands by the Falklands government. Every good deal for the United Kingdom is also a good deal. It also needs to be a good deal for the Falklands. And I believe that even though it's such a small place, we should not overlook it, as it's really good, and I think that we should all pay more attention to the Falklands. Thank you for listening, everyone, and goodbye.